not, you can always find our worship on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook. The full service is there. Sunday sit down all the way through the very end.
Yeah. So yesterday was week 2 in our Lent series. I cannot believe it's March today. I woke up, I was like, it's March. It's my birthday month, so
Ooh.
I like March. But it's
Big
just wild to think we're already a third of the way through Lent. But yesterday we focused on the Garden of Gethsemane, but more broadly, there was just a really nice thread that we drew all the way through gardens in general. So Cam sat down with you on the Sunday sit down and talked about our White Rock garden, and that was awesome to hear. I haven't seen Cam in person in like 9 months, so it was just so great to see her face.
Isn't that so weird that I know.
It was great, but it was like you two talked through what the community garden has kind of become, right?
And I love that you said that, right? That the majority of the folks who have plots in our garden aren't even White Rock members.
Right.
Which is so cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, and then we journeyed into the worship service and we talked about the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus journeying through this, very pressured, as you said, pressed, constricted kind of feeling in the garden.
Yeah, totally.
But, so let us know you're here. If you're watching live, just drop a comment and say that you're here. Tell us where you're watching and listening from. What were you going to say, Phil?
That you can also, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, but I was just actually, as I was thinking about it, I was like, I don't know if anyone actually joins our podcast on YouTube, but maybe they will today.
Maybe so.
Maybe today will be the day.
You know what was so funny though? So we sometimes tune into the church that my husband attends, and they were talking about gardening as well. They were talking about the parable of the soils, and so the pastor at that church was saying, he was talking about, like, he had a little table up there with him, and he had a piece of like stone, like a rocky path, and then rocks, and then weeds, and then grass seed and everything. So, and he was talking about gardening and tilling the soil, taking care of the earth. And then we came here. I was like, wow, this is like
all tying together.
Yeah, there's some synchronicity up in here.
I actually love, you and I had a lot of conversations leading up to Lent about this idea of having something tangible in the soil and, planting. And I love that Lisa Hancock also posted recently about, they're having some shoots coming out of the soil. And it's just, I've been in a couple different conversations with clergy and church people from other churches that are also doing things with soil throughout this. And so I love that we had this idea uniquely, but then also I don't know, it just seems like the Spirit was moving in such a way that it just drew a lot of us to this idea of, here we are, we can't do things like ashes in person and these practices that we're used to. So many of us were drawn back to the soil, and that's just really encouraging to me.
Yeah.
I'm sure it drives Mitchell crazy because he loves to be unique about things, but for us, I just love the connection there.
I think too. So the Pope and the Vatican put out some guidelines for celebrating Ash Wednesday if you can't be in person, and then other spiritual throughout the world kind of followed that, and they were putting forth kind of recommendations, ideas. Here's what you can do that's still tactile if you can't gather in person for Ash Wednesday and or Lent. And they also were talking about, go outside and rub soil between your hands. It was kind of eerie almost. I texted you. I was like, this is weird. I swear I got this idea before I even read that other, I can't even remember who it was right now, but one of the,
I want to say it was like North Carolina or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. But anyway, there's lots of, and I loved how too, I've never been to the Holy Land.
Oh my gosh, Rebecca.
I know. I've never been, and I felt like I was there though. I think you painted such a lovely picture, and you actually physically like walked me through the garden. It was really neat. As you were pictured, because I do, I've never been to that part of the world at all. So I really don't have any context, just pictures I've seen. And it was really neat that you started your sermon much more like a story. And really drew me in. And then talking about these olives, olive pressing. And we even had one person comment, like, where are you going with
Yeah,
this? Why are you
where's
talking
this
about
whole oil
olive
thing? Like
pressing? Yeah.
olive oil. Yeah.
But talk to us about like your process for writing that sermon, because it was different from other sermons you've preached here at White Rock.
Absolutely. In the planning process of this, I actually loved that I got like my week fell on the Garden of Gethsemane because it is such a personal thing to me. Just like everything I shared in the sermon yesterday, of this being such a personal experience and how it's like the holiest. The both times I've gone, even going the second time and knowing that the first time the Gethsemane experience is what almost saved my whole Holy Land experience. Just because I was with a bunch of skeptical seminary students and we were all just like bemoaning the fact that there's so many tourist traps in the Holy Land, but. Um, Gethsemane saved my first, and so the second time there was just such an expectation of like, this is what happened the first time. I'm nervous it's not going to happen, and again, the same thing happened. And I remember we
Mm.
stood in the garden and shared devotion together, and the it's called the Church for All Nations is there right next to the garden as well, and it's just one of my favorite churches in like Jerusalem too. It's just so beautiful. Um, so I don't know. When I was preparing for this, I went back and looked through some of my pictures. It's funny because Dexter's producing behind the scenes right now, and Dexter was with me the last time I was there, and we definitely. I was joking about seeing a camel at the top, like you really can ride camels. And one of the guys with us on the trip that time got knocked over by a camel. It was a whole
Oh,
thing.
cool.
Like,
Okay.
um, it, so there's some funny things in my head too, but. Dexter saying it was great. It was pretty hilarious. He was okay. That's why it was hilarious. Um, there the Mount of Olives is a really incredible place. They actually say it's some of the most expensive land in the world because there's a burial plot there, and you have to have you have to meet all these requirements to even get a plot there, and you walk past all of it, and just the history and the thinking of all the people who have walked this journey. And so honestly, my last week was really crazy. I had a lot of these things going on, and as I was doing it, it was kind of like my respite. Every time I'd come back to this sermon, reading through the garden experience, reminding myself of what those experiences were like in person. And then, like I said, looking through the pictures and being reminded of the beautiful flowers and the trees. It took me, like you said, the same way, it took me back to that experience once again. And so this sermon, more than others, I often have been a manuscript preacher just because I once was given the feedback that my mind is so all over the place that it's probably really good for me to hone it in and stick to the manuscript. But for whatever reason, I just thought, no, I'm going to write an outline for this one, and I'm going to just kind of let the experience of being in the Holy Land guide me through this journey. And so I did a lot of the kind of more teaching things that I'm more comfortable with rather than preaching as I preach this sermon, and then let kind of the narrative of the experience of being in the garden be what really guided me through and kind of kept me honed in.
I think I'm just thinking of sacred times that I've had, even though I haven't been to the Holy Land. I think a lot of us can say there's a space, whether that's a retreat center that we've been to, or a grandma's house, or for me it's a conference center in North Carolina called Lake Junaluska, that has that holiness, that sacredness to it, and I just think of when I go to Lake Junaluska and I sit beside the lake, or I watch the ducks, or I participate in worship, that I've been going to for decades, right? And so I've seen that place evolve, and I've showed up to it as it's evolved. It used to be that worship was held in this huge auditorium with no AC, which even in the mountains can get real hot in the summer.
Yeah.
And so it's this tactile, physical experience of holiness and presence that I'm interested, if you all who are listening and watching, if you have those experiences, I think that helps us connect with Jesus a little bit more, right? And it makes it less of just an unrelatable, standoffish story, right? That we know so well that we don't even pay attention to it. Like, okay, check, after Jesus ate the Last Supper, check, he went to the garden, check, he prayed, check, he was anxious, check, he got crucified. And that sounds really crass, but I think that's how we approach those stories sometimes, is that we forget just how personal and just how long they took, right? I mean, a dinner party celebrating the Passover probably was around midnight that it was finishing up. That's when most people would go home and go to bed. but he then spent more hours in anguish and prayer. And like, I just think those holy places that can provide comfort as well as inspiration.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole theology of space there, right? That we don't often talk about. I love in the Celtic tradition they call it a thin space. That there's certain places that provide this experience of a thin space between um, the holy or the sacred and the secular. I even hate to like put the dichotomy on that, but like just these places where you feel more of a connection to the divine than what you would in kind of a normal experience.
Yeah.
And I think it's good to talk about that, right? It's good to experience those things firsthand. But you're right; it's really important to even share about them and talk about them, because I'm reminded of the importance of words, and that words create worlds, And I forced myself this month to read a fiction book, because I don't read fiction very often, and so I'm reading The Sparrow, which is about Jesuits who are taken to go connect with the first aliens that the world discovers. It's really
Wow,
fascinating.
that's cool.
It's a really, really cool book on the human experience. But anyway, the way she paints the picture of this other world they go to, though, like the same thing. Like now I can't wait to get back to my book again to kind of be immersed in this world and like the new experiences. And if you've ever traveled to like a new culture or a new space, like a new country or something, you almost like walk around bright-eyed because you're just soaking in everything that you've never seen before, and there's these new experiences of that.
You know what that makes me think of, and this is random. This is totally not what we thought we were going to talk about when we were touching base earlier. I was watching NASA live last week with the Perseverance Mars landing, and I think that's what's so fascinating about that too, right? Is like this imaginary world that we've written sci-fi about for centuries now becomes tactile. Like now we have Earth substance on another like planet, and we've seen that in these rovers that land and take all these data measurements, and I just think it's fascinating. I think that once again, like I feel like I'm a broken record, but science and faith are not opposites. They inform each other, right? And so, and that's why I thought it was so fascinating too to hear you talk about the pressing of the olives, because that is more of it's not scientific, but it's more of a process-oriented thing. You don't think of it as being a faithful or a religious thing. That's what they did. That's what they do for money, right? That's what people still do. But it was really neat to think about these first fruits, second fruits, third fruits. I
really wanted to mine the metaphor even deeper and try to figure out like, was there a connection? And Mark doesn't really elaborate on this idea of the difference between the 3 times that Jesus prays, but we only get really the response after the first time, which is when he says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The second and third time, it's almost kind of like he went back and they were asleep again, and then he went back a third time and found him asleep again. But I wondered if there's like some kind of connection to this idea of the fruits of those different squeezes. Like after this third time of praying, was Jesus just so like was everything extracted from him, right? Like he was basically left fully empty, and there was not, even if that third prayer, I actually had this in my mind of like, did the quality of Jesus' prayer actually get worse each time because he was so frustrated or angry? And then I wondered like, did Jesus get really frustrated in his prayers and start saying things that maybe he wasn't proud of, like, and I don't know, like that's totally me reading into it, but I would. And so I wonder, like in solidarity, like does, clearly we have this anguish and these emotions, like I talked about, and the suffering that Jesus takes on, and even this doubt that Jesus takes on. But does he take on to the point of like, he starts spitting out some 4-letter words that maybe he's not proud about, but like ends up being the truest reflection of what he was really like going through and experiencing in that moment?
I think the repetition is important too. And that's what that Taizé song that we sang, Stay With Me, speaks to. I mean, that's what Taizé songs in general embody, right? Is this, I think something doesn't have to be complex to be very deep and spiritual. And so the text of that is coming right from that scripture. Stay with me, remain here with me, watch and pray. Like, stay awake, stay with me. I need company. I'm worried. I'm scared. And it's this repetition, right, that we sing over and over again until it all is a chant, right? And you move past the music and past the words. So I think that these repetitions are important too, that Jesus coming back and back and back to the disciples. I mean, falling asleep to life, when you were saying that, I just think like that's, in a way, that's such an Enneagram 9 thing to
I
say.
know.
But I've been there too, right? I mean, I'm tempted to say like I move much more toward the anxiety end of things. So I'm much more I'm awake all night because I can't sleep.
Yeah.
But it still is this notion of when do we metaphorically fall asleep to the world and we lose sight of compassion and empathy.
I didn't dwell on this in the sermon. I shared this story in Bible study last week when we were studying the scripture, but I think I briefly mentioned it in the sermon that like when I was working one time, I fell asleep standing up.
Yes.
We were working nights, and it was in this place called the Springfield Underground, Springfield, Missouri, that they built during the 50s because they're in the Cold War, right? They were afraid that if people needed to get underground. So there's this massive like city under the city, basically, where it's basically all storage now, but there's a whole lot of data down there. And so that's what we were doing. We were down there running data cables for this company that we worked with. My dad was an electrician. But it's like a 60-foot ceiling. And so we'd be on these massive lifts that would take us up. And so you had to drill up into the bottom of this like essentially cave, right? And so sometimes you'd be drilling up to put these anchors in and pieces would start to crack and just fall. It was really high intensity, right? And so my dad was on this lift with this kind of like, think of like almost a jackhammer kind of thing, putting in these anchors. And my sole responsibility at the time, like other times I was doing the drilling, but at the time was make sure the extension cord didn't get caught on anything so that it wouldn't either snap or become unplugged. And so I'm literally holding an extension cord. My dad's 60 feet in the air, drilling into this rock where like rock could potentially come falling down. And I'm standing there at like 3 a.m. and I literally fell asleep standing up. And my dad, and of course what happens, the cord gets caught on something and comes undone. And my dad's like, what are you doing down there? And there's like such this immense feeling of like, oh, I so screwed up here. Like I can't admit that I fell asleep standing up. That's a ridiculous example, but like it's so funny because Jessie will fall asleep sometimes, my wife, right? And she'll be like, what? I wasn't really asleep. And I'm like, no, it's okay if you were. You don't have to have like this negative connotation of falling asleep. In fact, like you should just go take a nap if you're that tired, like there's almost this idea of like, if I'm sleeping, then I'm not doing what I should be doing. And sometimes that's probably true, but this negative connotation that runs with this idea of something that's so natural and often so needed, Anyway, that's what was wrestling in my head in the midst of all that.
It's complicated for sure. And I think to me, there's this added layer of complication because we as a society tend to run on all cylinders and we think of rest as a bad thing. And yet, we see Jesus in this, I think maybe talking more metaphorically, like you're asleep. You haven't been getting, are you picking up what I'm laying down? I don't think you are, right? Like you're asleep to what I've been teaching you. And now time's run out. And I feel like there's so much more I have to say to you and there's not time. And so I think we have to wrestle with that. Like, how do we metaphorically stay awake to how Jesus is moving in the world, and not take it so literally that we're like, that we shame ourselves when we need rest, right?
That's such a good inclusion, Rebecca, because it's funny. I spent all week with that text and never even thought about that being taken. Like I talked about when I opened the sermon, kind of the truth behind the truth. And I think you're 100% right that there is an even deeper truth there with them being asleep too. Way more than just in the moment. And that's a really, I love that when you have a text like this, in almost any text, you can pull so many different things out of it. And there's a whole nother sermon in of itself, just simply based on what the disciples are asleep to.
Yeah. Right. And you can take that, there's a lot of conversation in this too about shame, right? Brene Brown talks a lot about shame. And so was Jesus trying to make the disciples feel guilty or ashamed? Was Jesus, not trying to do that, but just accidentally doing that because he was so upset he wasn't really tuned in? But I was going somewhere with this. Where was I going?
Well, what that made me think of is that often when hurt people, right? And so Jesus being in such a vulnerable state, like you were saying, doesn't have the capacity to even think about like, am I putting shame and guilt that's unnecessary on my disciples have continued to fail over and over again, right? And I keep inviting them back, and yet here they are again, and now I don't have the capacity to be gracious in this moment.
And that, so you mentioned very briefly high Christology versus low Christology.
Yeah.
And somebody who's not familiar with those words might kind of like, whoa, stop in their tracks. But basically, very simply put, high Christology, if you have this kind of scale that balances Jesus's divinity and Jesus's humanity, a high Christology puts more weight on Jesus's divinity, and a low Christology puts more weight on Jesus's humanity. And to me, I think in a very Methodist Wesleyan way, that the middle way is the best, right? When we hold these both in tension.
The via media. It's very Wesleyan, that's right.
It's very Wesleyan. But I think there are some moments where we see one on display more than the other. And you mentioned Transfiguration Sunday, right? So we got this moment where Jesus' divinity was more on display than his humanity. And now in this garden, we get this moment where Jesus' humanity is much more on display. And that can be really upsetting to people, right? Like when you said in your sermon, the Mount of Olives, I don't remember exactly what you said, but there's like a little side road. Like Jesus considering fleeing?
Fleeing, yeah.
And when you said that, I was like, oof, that could really be upsetting to people. I can just see that, saying, no, Jesus would never flee. He knows what's at stake. But what does it mean if we stop and pause and say, well, would I consider, if I knew I was going to be physically like tortured, yes, I would consider running away.
Yeah.
So
and in that, like, you can know what the ultimate outcome is going to be and still question if the timing is right. Like Jesus could have known that eventually this was going to be the ending, but I mean, again, the disciples probably didn't give him a lot of confidence that they're ready to take the reins,
Well, and also you can know what's right and you can know you're going to do it, but you just don't want to.
Totally. That's exactly right.
I'm trying to think of a more mundane example to bring it back down into because most of us, thankfully, are not going to be crucified. But it's pretty safe to say most of us listening to this podcast are not going to be crucified. But what are the smaller areas in our lives where we can relate to Jesus, right? And we can say, when we are feeling pressed, when the stone has been laid on our back for the third time, right? What are we going to choose? Yeah. If we're in a job and our boss says, like, you have this opportunity to move up and become partner, it's going to mean you're going to be traveling 7% of the time. And you've already promised that you won't take a job that's traveling more than 50% of the time.
Sure.
That's your pressure. And are you going to flee or are you going to stay?
Yeah.
So I just think, as Carmen said, like, so many facets. So you can read this text through so many different lenses.
I think this is why I like this. When we first talked about this series, I thought, I don't know if I love the idea of, focusing on the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. But I mentioned it yesterday too, that this, between the book study that we're doing and then again, getting our hands in the soil and then these sermons each week, it really is creating this overall experience for me. And I'm probably, because I'm invested in it way more than most are probably, it's having a more full experience for me. But this has been a really, and we're only, and this is week 2 of like our second Sunday in Lent. So this has been a pretty powerful experience for me for the last couple of weeks. And I think last week I did feel pressed on a couple different things too. So I think that was part of it as well, that it's easier to preach whenever it feels really relevant to what you're experiencing in life. But this is a good series, and I really do love the Gospel of Mark. I think it does a great job, and maybe that's because I can resonate better with the lower Christology aspect of it. But
interesting, yeah. It would be in one of my, I guess it was my New Testament class. The professor floated this question to us: where do you feel like right now your Christology is, more high or more low? Yeah. And it's really interesting to have those conversations with people, because it can be, I know this word is overused, but it can be very triggering for people.
Sure.
If they have grown up thinking like Jesus is untouchable, and then the concept is introduced that Jesus could have been tempted, that can be really shattering for people, or vice versa, right? If you're brought up thinking Jesus is a good and moral teacher, what in the world do I do with the resurrection? Do I believe in the physical resurrection?
Right.
Do I believe in the virgin birth? Do I have to believe, right? It opens all these doors. We could do a whole series on high Christology versus low Christology.
We totally could. Maybe one day. Maybe we won't call it that, but maybe one day.
Yeah, totally. We'll be more artsy.
Were there any other things you had music-wise that you really wanted to bring forth on, or the call to worship?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We didn't really talk about this last week because we were focusing on the musical aspects with Farron. But the call to worship, this
special music addition.
Yeah, right.
I'm an idiot.
You're not an idiot, Phil.
I had a typo.
It's okay. Yeah. It was Dexter's like texting us and it's distracting me. So the call to worship for the season of Lent it's these riffs on 24 hours is more than, right? So a life, one day is more than 24 hours. A meal is more than just bread and wine. Communion is more than just a remembrance. So it's opening up these doors just a crack, just a little bit, and then it's up to each person to walk through and discover what is waiting for them, right? And so, it's gonna be interesting because I'm changing it ever so slightly every week. So you can kind of be on the lookout for that. You can notice which lines I'm changing and which lines I'm leaving the same. Little Easter egg for you there.
Love that. Gotta listen to the podcast afterwards to know where the Easter eggs are.
Exactly.
I love that. Well, cool. I thought it was a great Sunday. I enjoyed the experience of it, and so well done as always on crafting a beautiful liturgy to go along with this series. And I'm looking forward to what happens next week. Even though I know the end of the story, I'm still excited for the experience.
So remind me, what are we talking about next week? Jesus being betrayed by Judas, right?
I think that is correct. I am double checking in the moment here, but I think you're correct. It's the betrayal and arrest.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about the psalm that Linda read. You did mention like that actually was the lectionary text, that portion of Psalm 22.
Interesting.
And so we think of Psalm 22 as just, that's the one where Jesus is crying, my God, my God. But there's a lot more complexity in that psalm. Those, as Carmen said, some of those different facets in a scripture that we think we know in our head, but there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I gave that encouragement to go back and read Psalm 13, and I still stick with that. I think that if you go and allow yourself the opportunity to sit in these lament psalms, and some of them kind of leave you hanging a little bit in lament, and others kind of add a bit of resolve. And I think it's perfect for Mark because Mark's gospel leaves you hanging a little bit.
Yeah, more than any of the others, for sure.
Which ending you read, right? That you just kind of hang there a little bit, and kind of like it's an invitation to write the rest of the story, basically. So, I encourage folks, go back and read Psalm 13 or any of the lament psalms to keep yourself rooted in this Christology and this aspect of the humanity of Jesus throughout this Lenten series.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for preaching, and thanks for everyone. You all help shape the liturgy, right? We're not just doing this in isolation. Your comments and your messages to us before and after the fact, you help us create what happens on Sunday morning. So it's not a vacuum. And we thank you for participating in that.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll be back next Monday.
Take care.
Bye-bye.